Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join our live demo covering GDPR. Have questions? Ask the experts. I'm Nate Hines, moderator of today's session, and we have a very special panel today. Joining me are Sacha Dawes, Principal Product Marketing Manager at Alienvault, John McLeod, Chief Information Security Officer at Alienvault, and special guest Dan Stocker, Practice Director of Cloud and Tech at Coalfire. All three of our speakers have extensive experience in information security, so please feel free to ask questions via the webcast chat window as they go through the presentation. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can before our Q&A session today. And with that, I will turn things over to Sacha to get started.
Great, thanks Nate. Thanks everyone for joining us today. GDPR, yes, obviously top of mind for many of folks out there. We continue to get a lot of questions, people just really trying to understand what it's all about, what's the impact to them. Anyway, hopefully we can help you through some of those questions in this webcast. Just in terms of what our agenda is going to be, obviously, I'm going to start talking a little bit, set the scene, GDPR for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to check in with some of our, John and my previous webcasts. Just again, set the groundwork, but then as quickly as possible, get into your questions and have our experts, John and Dan, answer with helping to answer some of those many questions. Lastly, for those of you interested who want to continue hanging out, how USM Anywhere can help with GDPR compliance. And I'll go into a quick demo of our product, USM Anywhere, and show how it can really help with technical controls. So as Nate introduced, I just want to recover or restate our panel today. So John McLeod, who's Chief Information Security Officer here at Alienvault. Thanks for joining us, John.
How's everybody doing?
Dan Stocker from Coalfire, Practice Director. As you can see from the photo, Dan is the fun one in the bunch. John and myself, we have the way official photos. So Dan, good job on the beads, and I'll catch you in New Orleans next time. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Great. And lastly, myself, Sacha Dawes, as a Principal in Product Marketing here at Alienvault. So just to, what is GDPR? Quickly set the scene. General Data Protection Regulation, also known as EU Regulation 2016-679. Of course, as with any legal or law, they like to put these technical or rather long code names in, but ultimately consists of 11 chapters, 99 articles, and 173 recitals. The recitals are really, they help clarify the articles and put them into more real-world context. It was adopted on 27th of April 2016, and as we are very well aware, in fact, many of us have probably got a little bit of fatigue on the matter, it becomes enforceable on the 25th of May, so right around the corner. And it is effectively like the Data Protection Act, which is currently enforced in the European Union, but it has teeth. And what it means by that is that there's some significant fines out there, and there's some additional guidance, but effectively GDPR is bringing the DPA up to date. And if you look at a lot of privacy regulations across the world, it's all about the fact that more and more information is being stored electronically, easily accessible, not just by the good guys, but obviously by the bad guys as well. And so, it's really, how to put better practices, better techniques, and approaches in place in order to be able to protect information. What is the goal? I mean, that's literally in a nutshell, to strengthen and unify data protection for all individuals within the European Union. And it's really, focused on those individuals wherever they reside across the European Union, any of those member states. Who does it apply to? Controllers and processors. So what is the definition between the two? Controllers are those that actually do the collection of personal data. They are the effective owners of that personal information, or they own or they are the responsible people for actually, they're gathering it for some business process or business reason in order to be able to do whether it's marketing or customer communications and so on and so forth. And Article 24 of GDPR states that the controller needs to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure that processing of that data is performed in accordance with that regulation. And by processing, we're talking about the actual activity of collecting, maybe actually transforming that information and communicating it back out. And that's in light of processors, that can be an entity that processes that personal data on behalf of the controller. In many instances, the same organization may be the controller and the processor. In other organizations, again, the controller may do the collection, but they may outsource some of the processing to a third party. Security tools and obviously things like USM Anywhere, that's where we process data and information to identify security alerts. And in that sense, USM Anywhere and Alienvault is a processor of information for security purposes for many customers out there. And that's governed by Article 28. And that really, again, tells controllers you need to make sure that processors who provide sufficient guarantees or are out there doing the necessary steps, have the processes and controls in place to make sure that information is, again, protected. What's expected? Really, three core things. GDPR states that controllers and processors, those two entities, must detect and prevent a personal data breach. And that, as you can see from this list, is a wide variety of things that could happen to personal data. So accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or access. So it's not just about someone getting hold of the data and then stealing it, but if data is deleted, accidentally or otherwise, that's seen as a breach under GDPR, and that may lead to notification. So by default, you need to notify the relevant authority. What do I mean by that? Each EU member state, so it could be France, Germany, and so on and so forth, will have an authority assigned for all things GDPR. And regardless of the type of breach, you need to notify them within 72 hours that a breach has occurred, or since you became aware of that breach taking place. That's covered by Article 33. And Article 34 says you must notify the actual data subjects or the individuals or entities affected by that data breach if that breach results in high exposure of information of that person or entity. What I mean by that is that, let's say a hospital has a number of data records deleted. There's no real exposure of the entities because the information was just deleted. So the hospital needs to notify the relevant authority, but does not necessarily have to communicate that out to the data subject. If, on the other hand, that data was captured and exfiltrated out of the organization, then yes, medical records, it's a high risk of exposure to that particular those entities affected. In that case, you need to both notify both the relevant authority as well as the affected data subjects. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. And this is really where we get into our, FUD meter. John, I think, you pulled the slide together. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There's just so much concern still out there. We're getting to that, I guess, period of frantic frenzy as people are just trying to figure out, okay, if I'm not quite there yet, some people haven't even started, what do I do?
There is, and I'm even receiving unsolicited emails, probably about 5 of them daily, saying, the sky is falling around GDPR. And, those types of companies I just ignore. I want to go to companies that actually understand GDPR and actually provide good data and some guidance around that. And there's actually quite a few of them out there as well.
Yeah, great. And Dan, I'm sure you hear a bunch as well from your clients and customers. So, but anyway, let's move forward and get into the Q&A. So, Dan, John, I hope you're ready. We're going to get into it right now.
Sure thing.
Now, just to try and set the scene, we've created 6 buckets or categories of questions that we're going to go through. So please, submit your questions, and we'll try and get to them in the right bucket. If you haven't answered a question late, we'll work on getting to that as well. But this just gives a framework to think about of the types of questions that we get quite frequently and that we're going to discuss now. And we're going to go through each of these in turn, probably spend 5 or so minutes in each bucket. Well, obviously not 10 minutes because that's another hour. But anyway, we'll get through as best as possible. So let's start off with what is GDPR and who's affected. So I covered a little bit about who's affected, but there are some interesting questions that are already coming in. And so, in fact, I'm going to start with this one. I'm located in the U.S. Do I need to comply with GDPR? So, John, I don't know if you can take that one.
Yeah, I'll address it. Well, it depends on what you're doing in the U.S. Is really the biggest question back to you. But I'll give you an example. So if you're in a company that is collecting business contact information from anywhere in the world, and some of that contact information is from European citizens, then obviously you are affected by GDPR because you're actively collecting some contact information. The problem is that you would need to step back and kind of take a look at is, why are you collecting it? And then how are you collecting it? In other words, are you getting consent and things of that nature? So really, when you start delving in from a business process standpoint, I highly recommend talking with outside counsel and really get a better understanding of what all of the controls that you would need to put into place on collecting that type of information. And that's just one example.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, another interesting one that just popped up. Dan, I think this is a good one for you. Where'd it go? Is there a PDF or Excel file which compiles all the articles and requirements of GDPR?
The answer is yes. Thanks for the easy question. In fact, we often recommend our clients download the collected articles and recitations that are published by the Information Commissioner Office in the UK, ICO, as they're known. And this, I keep this particular PDF open on my desktop daily because it is a great place to refer down to details of the actual wording of both the articles and the very useful recitations, as Sacha's already noted.
Yeah, in fact, in terms of where you can get hold of that PDF, I know that there's a couple of websites out there. One is the kind of central GDPR website. I forget the URL off the top of my head, but we can definitely post that into the chat window or provide that answer later on as well. That
link also provides a useful way to search as well. So there's both links. So I can get you the one I'm talking about, and we can post the EU searchable GDPR reference as well.
Yeah, I think we'll go with your link primarily because you're like you said, you're seeing this day over day, and it's definitely not the most exciting read, but definitely worth going through as best possible. Here's another good question, and Dan or even John, I'll leave this over to you. How will the authorities be able to tell who should be GDPR compliant?
That's interesting. So I don't think that in the beginning, and when I say the beginning, the first several years, we're going to see authorities run around to see if you're actually GDPR compliant. I just don't see that happening. But what I do see happening is complaints being filed to the appropriate supervisor authorities, and then those supervisor authorities are going to be questioning those companies where the complaints are coming in from. And so you've got to actually, you have an obligation to respond to those supervised authorities. And so if you are processing, EU citizen personal data, especially like their healthcare data, I mean, you really need to be prepared for some of these tough questions that could be coming from the supervisor authorities.
Yeah. Let me just add to that I was part of a QA recently with the Information Commissioner Office from the Ireland, and Ireland being a particularly important player among the member states because so many U.S. technical firms choose to have their main registrar office in Ireland. And the enforcement question to the commissioner was met with a response that the commission is taking a proactive set of steps early on prior to the onset of enforcement, as you know, coming at the end of May. But it's in the consultative mode, in a sense that they are reaching out to companies that there may be issues with and trying to engage early to try to figure out what the right way of working with them is. So yes, I agree with John that, people aren't going to be knocking on doors like that. But at the same time, there's a real awareness of it being a sea change, and the commissioner's offices are going to be taking a proactive approach to it.
Great, thanks, Dan. So here's, in fact, the question starts off with a big question, but in fact, this is an interesting area. So it says, maybe it's a yes or no question. Dan, this one's for you. Can you confirm or deny that GDPR applies to the collection of data provided by EU citizens who reside permanently or temporarily outside of the EU? EU. So especially when they provide data to an organization when they're outside of the European Union. The reference goes back to dual citizens that may be out there. But, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that is a real question, believe it or not. I think that the proper form of analysis to that is the complex of not just the identity of and physical location of the person providing the personal data, but also the relationship into which they are providing the data. If it is a EU citizen providing data to an EU organization that does business in the EU, I think there's a lot less scope for that transaction to be considered not GDPR relevant than there is for that EU citizen, for example, to provide data to a US company that has no nexus to Europe otherwise. So yes, I know there's been a lot of focus on how the territoriality that's mentioned in the articles is applied, but I think that any court is going to take a broader approach to figuring out whether or not that we need a particular transfer of data from data subject to data controller should be governed by GDPR. And I think that's certainly a safer way for organizations to proceed.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Okay, here's another good one. Does GDPR affect a small family office located in the EU? Or maybe we can even broaden that question and say, what are the types of organizations that need to be subject to that are subject to GDPR?
I'll take it at first. So it's all about the data. What data are you collecting? What data are you processing? It just boils down to that simply. And the biggest thing that I cannot stress enough is the days of collecting personal data on people and you keep it permanently are gone. Those days are over with under GDPR. You've got to have a reason to collect this data. You've got to have a purpose. And then the how-to you collected that data. Is it legal? Is it consent? Is it, some other means on why you collected that data? So from a small home office perspective, it just depends on the data that you're trying to collect or process.
That's a good one. Dan, anything to add on that one?
A strong reinforcement of John's notion that, or advertisement that collection without limitation or retention without limitation is acceptable. It is not. And in particular, specifically that after a time in which the purpose for the collection of the data is passed. In other words, data is collected, it is processed for the purpose it's collected. After that processing, there's a sort of explicit assumption that the data will then be deleted and that ongoing holding of it must be subject to a different lawful basis, right? And there are some actually articulated in the GDPR, which is an extension of the Data Protection Directive that it supersedes. The home office question was also part of some of the roundtables that I was at recently. And while no official guidance was given specifically, it was noted that people won't have to provide administrative evidence of GDPR compliance, for example, for keeping track of their relatives' national ID numbers, for example, in the case where those relatives are elderly, for example. In other words, regular family-like activities where you keep track of personal information, clearly not intended to be burdened by this extra evidentiary and legal compliance. As you come up the organizational complexity scale, where that stops, and you are expected to, there has not been official guidance on, but there will be, and you can use some of the jurisprudence from under the Data Protection Directive as an early guidance on that.
Great. Well, obviously, a lot of questions still coming in this particular area, but just for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the next one. In fact, I think we've already touched on a couple of questions that come under this category, but what is the impact of businesses outside of the EU? So in fact, let me just find one that was an interesting one on this area. In fact, So if we are compliant with GDPR, then will we also be compliant with similar certifications or regulations in other markets like the Middle East, Singapore, and Hong Kong? That's, I guess that comes down to, is there a generic privacy or approach to privacy regulations across the world? I mean, John, what's your perspective on that?
I may punt this one to Dan.
Oh, that's fine.
You know, it's interesting when you work the compliance world and you are trying to juggle many different countries' data privacy directives or laws. You know, it's kind of interesting on where a company may sit. So in our particular case, luckily, you know, we do have offices in the EU. So in my particular situation, in our company particular situation, it kind of makes it easier. But like you were saying, if you were to kind of bleed over and meet some of the other regulations or laws in the other countries, I think I would definitely have more gray hair. But Dan, do you have anything to follow up with that?
I can loan you a few gray hairs, John. The Hong Kong data directive, data protection ordinance, I should say, is reasonably new, but it does have some significant overlap with GDPR. I am not an expert on that, although it's on my to-do list. And the better angle to the question is where the company is versus GDPR expectations, right? Because the question of whether GDPR and local data protection laws overlap is in fact a separate question. So if you're concerned with a data protection authority in the EU with enforcement from that angle, and you are located in the United States, then the question for you is, A, have you engaged external counsel, as John noted earlier, right? Because these kinds of questions, neither John nor I are qualified to give you detailed answers on, certainly not in the webinar. And secondly, the kinds of questions you'll have to answer are, what is your connection to the EU? Do you have an office in the EU? If you do, that's pretty clear that you do have some obligations there. That in other words, the court in the EU can obtain jurisdiction over you. If you don't, you have no connection to the EU whatsoever, then counsel can give you an idea of where your risk lies. Because if you actively market to EU citizens, even if you don't have an office in the EU, there's a credible claim that you are doing business in the EU, and as such are involved in the processing of European citizen data. So that's one way of cutting that and slicing that problem up.
Got it. Now, in fact, building on that, a similar question is, hey, if I'm a U.S. healthcare organization and I collect information about EU citizens while they're in the U.S., am I subject to GDPR? I think you just covered the answer to that in your previous question, but I just want to clarify because we've actually had a couple of questions in that particular area.
Yeah, there's a sense, I think, in which the GDPR can be read as a lever to move the world. However, the practicalities of the matter, in that if you are the word entirely being in the dictionary sense, U.S.-based organization that has no nexus to Europe other than occasional European citizens having to go out of their way to give you information as opposed to you ask them for it, then you may be able to consider GDPR an entirely external idea. That said, that decision to adopt that risk posture should be informed by consultations with counsel.
Got it. Yeah, there's definitely one of the things that I think, John, you also recommended in our last webcast is definitely consult with counsel or legal representation on many things, and obviously working with a consultant like Coalfire in helping you really get objective about your security controls, extremely important, especially because this is a legal requirement. It is law, and really understanding how much you may or may not be affected. In many cases, that third party or legal representation is the best one to provide that information.
Absolutely, and I can't stress this enough, and I'm glad that we have so many folks on the phone, is don't do this in a vacuum. Ask as many people, as many questions as you can, and try and figure out the best approach for your company or your situation. And as Sacha was saying, one of our first steps was to contact a third-party consultant agency. And fortunately, Coalfire is the one that we've used all last year for PCI and HIPAA and some other things. So it's kind of natural we selected them for consultation on our approach to, and our journey, I guess I should say, into GDPR. As well as we use an outside counsel, that their law firm is Gunderson. They're wonderful, great, smart folks in privacy law, but there's many other law firms out there too that have some really great articles on the web, and as well as great privacy attorneys. And I just can't stress this enough. Everybody's going to have their own journey into GDPR, and you just got to make sure that you're doing what's right for your company.
Thanks, John. So let's move on to the next category. So what is personal data? In fact, there's some interesting questions that are popping up just to that really emphasizing, hey, how can we figure out what we need to protect? And this one came up with, how does do IP addresses of machines count as personal data? Because everything connected to a network has an IP address, and so that may be gathered and monitored and looked upon. So is the IP address on a personal computer deemed as personal information? Maybe Dan, maybe you can provide some examples of what is and is not.
Sure. Short answer is yes. In almost every case, an IP address would be considered personal data. And it's important to shed some of the common sense understandings of what personal data is. Because in this case, personal data is defined legally as data that could allow you to identify someone. And the IP address does fit that description. All sorts of other things that wouldn't seem individually to be personally identifiable data also are. And that's because taken in concert together, they could identify someone. And this is one of the more technical aspects of the GDPR, in the sense that crafting data sets that are useful for processing purposes can be difficult without them being identifiable. And the GDPR offers one particular tool to help mitigate some of that risk. And I want to mention it here in this context. And that's pseudonymization, which is difficult to say and to spell, as it turns out. And it refers to taking a data set and removing just enough of the personally identifiable data such that the remaining parts, there's a high confidence that they can't be, any individual who's represented there could not be re-identified. It's not the same as anonymization, where there is no chance of re-identification. And the intended purpose for this, for example, is very definitely, and this is useful for folks who are going to outsource their processing, for constructing data sets that their processors can work with without exposing all of the personal data of the underlying data subjects. So it's a risk mitigation tool. And the paying attention to this, and this is veering into the tools and processes question, Sacha, so I apologize for anticipating that early. But having an understanding of what your organization has in the way of data that is from individuals and it relates to individuals, and then what the processing will be for that data, right? Inventory of stuff you have and what you're doing with it, will help you then be able to be in the right position to make some actual effective choices about how to protect that data. So I've danced a little bit around having a very direct, this is, this isn't, that isn't, personal data. And the reason for that is that context matters. And I hope that that's what you'll remember coming out of this, at least, is that there's analysis of what you're doing that has to be centered in details rather than being abstract.
That's great.
I just want to add one quick thing, and that's more addressing the security folks in the audience. And that is, we all know that, the one thing that we want to do in a network is find and detect evil in your network. And actually, Recital 49 states that we need to do that. So in order to do that, you've got to collect, usernames and location data and IP addresses and whatnot. And that's okay. It's okay. And it goes back to what Dan is saying. Why are you processing that data? And then how long are you processing that data? And you just, in the security world, we're processing it to find evil, to stomp evil out, but we don't keep any of those records for any longer than necessary. And that's the key there about that type of processing. And there's many, many other examples about processing location data or IP addresses, but it's really boils down to the why and the how and the how long of that particular data set.
Yeah. In fact, another interesting question, I think, John, you talked a little bit about the communicating the policy of defining how you're going to use the information. An interesting question that just came in, and Dan, I'll let John answer this first, and you may have some add-on afterwards, is that one of our audience is in the EU and says, hey, my organization is requiring that I provide my home phone number to the organization. So obviously that's a piece of personal information used by the organization, or at least maintained by the organization. And they're asking, well, do I really need to provide that? And I don't think GDPR states about whether an organization collects information. But John, given the fact that we as Alienvault are going through the motions, what's your perspective on getting personal information and how we keep and process it?
I've said this several times. It's the why. Why does the company want to collect that information? And I think it's necessary for a company to collect personal phone numbers or whatnot. I mean, in the cases of emergencies is a great example. We must get a hold, as a company, our human resources department or whatnot must, or a manager get a hold of that particular employee in the event of emergency. And to me, it's that simple. Now, is that data protected once it's collected? Those are those controls that really need to be looked at more from the compliance folks or the security folks, depending on what organization you're in. And then there's some risks there that you can apply on collecting that information.
Yeah. Well, good. I think that, in fact, again, we're going to pop to the next category. So steps and tools to comply. Now, obviously, as all the categories, quite broad, but we're definitely getting a lot of questions about the right to be deleted or the right to be forgotten. And there's definitely been some tweaks and tunes on this. But Dan, how realistic? So one of our audience is questioning how probable it is to ensure that your information is deleted. But what are the kind of steps that organizations have to take place in order to show their customers that their information has been forgotten, or are there situations where the converse might be true?
Yes, this is the proving a negative kind of conundrum. Yeah. Yes, we've forgotten you. We have a record right here that we've forgotten you. That record has you in it. Yes, I've been asked this question several times. So, a short answer is yes, there's going to be lots of requests to be forgotten. That's everyone acknowledges that's going to happen. Whether it's a tsunami or just a rising tide remains to be seen. But it's definitely going to be the case. And so organizations that are ill-equipped to respond to those requests for data subjects to exercise their rights, that's going to be an actual operational and compliance issue for them. So to take a step back, instead of looking at this being now day one, oh my God, people have asked to be forgotten, think about planning ahead for this. Some of the other aspects of the GDPR that are important in this area are going to be something that's reasonably boring in one sense. It's engineering, it's product management. It's going to be the requirement for privacy by default and privacy by design. These are processes that are intended to be represented in product and service management. So that if that is the case, if as an organization you build out an understanding that the way your product works is intended to support these kinds of things, you will have less trouble later when they are actually asked for. So let's come back to the present, right? You've received a request to be forgotten. The question then is, are the data structures that support your product or service can they be selectively edited and still maintain referential integrity, right? Does it introduce any gaps then which will be like a misfire for your analytics or your other product data analysis that supports what you do? If you haven't thought of this stuff yet, I recommend that you do, because a lot of it actually questions a great deal of how an organization has designed its product in the first place. And so it really is, it's kind of like a whole new question that you wouldn't have had otherwise, not part of the usual roadmap. So those are going to be challenges for sure. The trivia question about how an organization would prove that it has forgotten someone. There was no specific guidance coming from the Article 29 Working Party or any of the DPAs about how that evidence should be packaged. At least no guidance that I'm aware of. If only because much of that is going to be probably down to individual jurisprudence in the case of people who have promised to have forgotten someone and then not done it. An organization, for example, that is told not to send marketing data to someone, right? They're allowed to keep a record of that person that they're not allowed to send marketing data to, so that they can then not send marketing information to them. If they're asked to be forgotten, it may be the case that that record of not sending them marketing information is now not going to go away. And so there's a bunch of little consistency details that I think people haven't fully thought out yet, at least even people in the industry. And so I expect some shakeout of some of those details to come, and at a minimum, some kind of templatized guidance for small and medium-sized businesses, as opposed to large organizations which have the ability to think these issues through on a larger scale. John, are you hearing anything else about this?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And actually, this is some of the same type of thoughts I had, as well as some of the readings I've done, as well as communicated with our outside counsel. And the key here is, when you get that request on right to be forgotten, is there anything that you can do something with that request? In other words, if they're telling you they want their payroll records deleted, obviously most countries have some sort of legal obligation that you've got to keep those payroll records for a certain amount of time. So therefore, I would default to your records retention type of a policy. But then let's say you get that right to be forgotten about their human resources records. Maybe there is something other within that record set that you could delete. Maybe not the fact that, maybe it is your company policy to keep any kind of reprimands or something like that for a certain amount of time. But maybe that there is something other within that record set that you can at least show that you're trying to do something other around right to be forgotten.
That's cool. Another couple of things are really popping up, and again, I'm not wanting to jump forward just yet, but so we'll probably have a little bit less time on the next two categories. But great question here, Dan, and even John, you probably have some response for. My company's been collecting data for several years, and we have data that's being processed, so that it actually makes it difficult to really get back to, or really get to the actual personal records. It's all mixed in. Do we need to get rid of it? Is there any grandfathering clause, for example, or how is that impacted by GDPR?
I'll take this one, Dan, right quick, and let you piggyback on it, because this is kind of an interesting one. Because depending on who you are in the audience, your mindset could be, let's say you're a marketing person, and marketing people love keeping data around. I don't know why, but they just do. But the question I go back to our marketing folks is why? And then what data are you interested in keeping? So if you're just trying to keep business contact information, as a compliance person, I would consider that some sort of low risk about keeping just business contact, because you need that information. You're trying to sell a product, or maybe they are a customer, and you've got to keep that information. But what you do, or what you can do, is limit the amount of information you do keep on a particular individual and more focus on that particular company. Maybe the company has a particular license or whatever that you're trying to collect on that thing. And I think just as long as you're concentrating more and that the spirit isn't necessarily targeting that particular individual, but more or less doing whatever you need to do about trying to make that sale to a company and not a particular individual. And I'm just using that as, again, one example. Dan?
I agree. There's going to be all sorts of data squirreled away, right? The pack rats of the data world. There is no grandfathering under GDPR. So yes, that does represent some kind of technical/compliance debt. However, the situation, again, details will matter. And in the case where data cannot be reasonably separated from its mixed in nature, if that's sort of one reading of the question, Sacha, then the more defensible position to take would be to do a detailed risk assessment of the risk to the privacy of the people whose data has been mixed together. And if it can be supported via that analysis that there's a low risk of that data being re-identified for a new individual, then it may be considered already pseudonymized, right? Which is an actual technique the GDPR allows. So that's what's one way of looking at the question.
I think one other very closely aligned is how do we treat our backups? So we have offline backups on tape or stored away somewhere. How do we treat those?
So from a security perspective, or I should say, if I put my compliance hat on, I look at things through a risk management lens. So yeah, backups, if they contain, let's say, medical record information or what other sensitive data, those backups need to be, locked away and hardened in a secure environment, whatnot. But if the backups contain, let's say, just business contact information, I consider that more or less a low risk. Therefore, maybe you don't need multi-factor authentication protecting that particular backup set. So again, I can't stress this enough. You got to know the data. You got to know what data is on that backup set, and then you can kind of apply your risk assessment to that set.
Yep. Okay, I think we're going to move on to responding to a breach. So we've got a couple of questions in this particular area. And just to note, I mean, we've got about, I'll say probably about 7 or 8 minutes left of the Q&A. Obviously, there's lots of questions that have been coming in, so apologies if we have not been able to or had the time to get to your question. But we'll do the best we can in the next 8 or so minutes. So on this one, so, what are the steps that you may want to start investigating? The question is, what should I do if I do suspect a breach has taken place? So, John, I know that you've been putting a bunch of controls in place and working with Coldfire to really understand do we have the right things in place for GDPR. But what's your perspective on this?
So with breaches, there's 3 main things that you need to really concentrate on. One is your breach notification policy. Make sure that is updated to reflect the information with GDPR in it. If you wrote a breach notification policy, let's say in the HIPAA world, you just need to kind of tweak it a little bit because, again, it's about that particular data set. The other thing is your incident response plan. Make sure it's updated. Make sure it's ready to go. I consider your incident response plan isn't something that you write and you stick on a shelf and you just sit and wait. I like the idea that the incident response plan needs to be a live document that's always updated. That way it's fresh, it's new, everybody understands what's in it. And whether you put it, and the third thing is whether you put it as an appendix to your incident response plan or even just an attachment to your breach notification policy, is example templates. You don't want to sit there and kind of wait until the last minute to try and figure out how am I going to draft a letter up to a particular individual that we lost their medical information. So you kind of want to have those templates kind of already filled out. Now you can tweak the templates once the breach occurs and whatnot. But that's basically those 3 main items, paper-wise, I guess if you want to call it that you really need to make sure that is in place.
Another good question. Oh, sorry, Dan, go ahead.
One add to that is that for folks who are coming into the GDPR world is to note that the 72-hour expectation for notification of breach is a radical departure from ordinary industry best practice. It's a much tighter expectation. And so having the ability for this muscle to not to be really well exercised, meaning testing, tabletop exercises, some kind of warm-ups, so that in the event that there is something, knock on wood, that you're able to respond without pulling a muscle, so to speak. That's a recommendation from us as well.
And I do want to clarify one thing about I wholeheartedly agree with what just Dan said. And the way GDPR is written, it's you must kind of act in this without undue delay. But I do want to state your typical breach scenario is what I'll call it. And let's say you've got an outside entity that contacts you, let's say GCHQ or maybe even the FBI, depending on your location or whatnot. Most times they're going to tell you that you've got a host within your environment communicating to a known bad host. That's probably all the information you're going to get. So from an incident response perspective, that's not a breach yet. You just got a host communicating with a bad host. Where the breach comes into place is, again, about the data. So it's okay to start peeling the onion and finding out what is being communicated to that host. And if it is data, that's when that 72-hour clock starts. I can't stress that enough. If there's one thing you take away today, it's all about the data.
That's a great point. Talking about the 72 hours, one question that's popped up is, we talked about, or the regulation talks about, you must notify the relevant authorities within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach. And just emphasize being aware of the breach. Now, if we need to notify individuals, do they have to be notified within that 72-hour window as well, or how does that work? Dan, do you have any comment on this one?
Yeah, I think that there is an expectation that there were actual specifics in black and white in the articles there, but the expectation is that for very high-profile cases, at a minimum, that the DPAs are notified, and that there's further expectations that individuals affected by the breach would be notified, and that's regardless of whether it's high profile or not. So yes, being aware of that and having that built into the process as both awareness in terms of, and also in terms of being able to actually exercise the plan that has that as a goal is going to be key.
Okay, so in fact, good. That's I'm going to wrap up that section. Thanks, John and Dan. Acts of non-compliance. So we got an interesting one. How do we deal with EDiscovery/litigation? So we capture forensics images relating to a matter. Maybe the search terms are broad. How do we handle that in terms of, again, maintaining compliance?
For those of you that know me on the phone, I've got a pretty good vast background in electronic discovery. And then if you apply GDPR to it, the bottom line is you've got litigation happening. So you have a legal means and a legal authority to capture that particular information to settle whatever matter. It could be the employee suing the company for all we know. And so it is okay to capture that particular information. I think they called it forensics imaging. So even in the disk forensics imaging, the thing here is, and usually in the e-discovery world, we do a really good job at locking up our evidence because it is considered evidence, and there's a chain of custody. So we do a really good job at protecting that data, and I see no issues whatsoever, just as long as the data is protected. Now, of course, once the litigation is over with, get the proper authorities from your attorneys and you can dispose of that evidence. You don't want to just keep it forever.
Thanks, Tom. Well, here's a good one. Are GDPR milestones, it's basically, is there any wiggle room for organizations given the fact the date is upon us? And as we've all heard, many organizations out there aren't quite ready. Dan, I'll throw this one in your direction.
I will give you a direct quote, a word-for-word quote from the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. There will be no grace period.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they've been pretty adamant about that. So anyway, definitely something to be considered of.
I do want to say this kind of follow up, and I agree with everything. We all need to be ready by May 25th. But what does ready actually mean? For most companies, from a technical perspective, we probably have all the technical controls in place to protect data. That's most companies, talking with my peers and whatnot. It's the administrative side. It's how do you deal with that right to be forgotten? How do you deal with some of that administrative things that are coming in? And you definitely need to be ready on that administrative side by May 25th.
Yeah. I think that underscores, I mean, you can certainly take a look through the regulations to understand the impacts from a financial perspective, but those can be pretty steep as well. I think that what we'll be selling is the first time the European Union takes companies to court on this. I mean, it's the same with any regulations that are introduced. I don't know, John, do you have a perspective on that as well?
I was reading a question as you were talking, so sorry about that. Dan, did you hear it? Because I was reading a question.
Forgive me, no. I was looking at the slides.
Sorry about that, everyone.
So the question came up in terms of who do we expect to see, or what do we expect to see in terms of kind of penalties or public cases with regards to GDPR? Do you expect those to take place pretty quickly?
This is my own opinion, not reflective of anybody else or any other company, but I think this summer is going to be the summer of litigation. And what I mean by that is we all know Facebook's in the news right now, and our own U.S.'s FTC is going after Facebook for potential fines, allegedly, with the legal world. And I think that it only makes sense for individuals to go to their EU citizens, to go to their supervised authorities or file complaints and whatnot against a lot of the big giants is what I'm going to call them. So I think that talking with some of my peers in some of those companies, they are preparing for, I think Dan used it earlier, a tidal wave. So they are preparing for a tidal wave of requests this summer.
Yeah, some heads on a pike at the gate is one expectation, right? To warn off others. The data protection authorities that I've seen interviewed have gone out of their way to paint their early efforts as consultative, not as bloodthirsty. And yet there is such an incredible. They are political institutions, so there is some response to public sentiment that's going to be involved, and so some high-profile example where most people can get behind is probably, I think, going to be one likely outcome early on.
Great. Well, with that, we really conclude our Q&A session. We don't have a lot of time left, so I'd just like to thank John, thank Dan, thank you both for going through the Q&A session. Obviously, a lot of great questions. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to yours. We'll see if we can get back to you with answers down the road. But anyway, thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Dan, thank you. We're going to for the next 5 minutes, just show you a little bit about Alienvault USM and how that product, or our USM Anywhere product, can really help support your GDPR compliance program. So we've covered the high level. Really, it's about detecting and preventing breaches, as John talks about, protecting against evil, and also the ability to, if a breach is detected, being able to really do the necessary investigation. John talked about having a good incident response plan, but with regard to tools and capabilities to really understand what's going on, that's really where, especially in the IT space, you need to have something like a SIM in place, something that's automatically collecting and logging the data to allow you to go to one spot in order to be able to do that investigation. John, I think you'll agree 72 hours in any instant investigation is not a lot of time. And so, having to go out to individual machines to look at logs could be quite time-consuming in itself.
I agree, and it's very necessary to have the right tools in place. An endpoint detection tool is definitely necessary, as well as some sort of central collection, like our product that we're about to show you.
Yeah, just to point out, one of the things that we covered in our last webcast, if you haven't had the opportunity, check out the Resource Center on alienvault.com. You'll find the link for our previous webcast. But it's all about not just technical controls, but administrative controls. In fact, if you look at this chart, the defense in depth approach, it's talking about the different technical controls you can put in place, but things like process, policy, especially, how the organization is guided on how to comply, your employees trained, and so on and so forth, is critical. Now, when it comes down to technical controls, that's where we have the Alienvault USM platform, which really bundles a number of technical controls into one solution. We have the asset discovery, and vulnerability assessment, really knowing what is out there, where vulnerabilities exist on those end assets, those endpoints, because realistically, that is where the data is kept and processed. Being able to prevent or detect, breaches, that's where the intrusion detection, the behavioral monitoring really comes in. So, especially from prevention to actually detect to actually compromise, it's all a case of time. So being able to do this in as short an amount of time as possible is critical. And last but not least, we have the SIM correlation log management. It's all about pulling in all the information into one central location so that you can actually do the monitoring and the investigation down the road. And so USM Anywhere, we have the ability to monitor your cloud environments, AWS and Azure, your on-premises environments, or private clouds like Hyper-V, VMware, as well as monitor cloud applications like Office 365 and G Suite. One of the other things that we also incorporate is our threat intelligence. And so we have threat intelligence from our own Alienvault Lab security research team. They do all the research, so you don't have to. All that information gets into the product to power the product. We also have our Open Threat Exchange, which in fact says 65,000. We're actually up to 80,000 global participants, but a lot of information being contributed by that community in order to find out things like indicators of compromise and really help accelerate detection of what's going on across your environment. So I'm going to jump into the product. You should see our overview dashboard here, just a real quick summary of what's going on. We can see what kind of alarms, kind of alerts of priority that have been generated. We can see what kind of activities are going on. So obviously, very much focused on security of what's going on in your environment. I'll come back to the top in a minute. We can see where those alarms and events are coming from, looking at trends. So again, if there's spikes or huge dips, it could be indicative of something going on that I want to investigate. What assets do I have out there? Again, what operating systems, what software is running on each? Which of those assets are creating the most alarms? So, it could be indicative of either an attack or highly risky systems. And that's where we come down to vulnerability assessment to really understand, again, where are the areas of high, medium, and low vulnerabilities from a risk perspective. So being able to identify that so we can proactively go ahead and go and mitigate those risks. And then last but not least, we have our alarms by intent. So we categorize them by a kill chain taxonomy, really understanding the path of an attack from things like environmental awareness. It could be things like people spinning up user accounts, all the way up to system compromise, which is really indicative of, say, an attack actually taking place. So I can actually drop into one of these and click on the link, and it's going to take me to the number of attacks that are taking place, some suspicious behavior going on here, and I can drill down into here and get more understanding of what's going on. Again, going back to that detect and prevent, it's looking for those anomalies that are taking place and being able to drill down into the event itself and get more information about what's going on in that environment. Now, if I could pop back and see any other set of alarms, you can see there's a number of activities going on here. Brute force authentication, successful authentication after a brute force authentication. So I can drill into here, again, get more information about what's going on, which user has potentially been compromised so that I can initiate my incident response plan. I can also do things like select actions. So one of the things I may want to do is work with one of our other security solutions to say, okay, maybe it's a particular endpoint that's being compromised. I can work with Carbon Black and isolate that endpoint all from within this console. What will happen is it's going to send the information about the alarm to Carbon Black, and Carbon Black is going to take care of actually isolating that host from the system, and that's especially effective in a situation like malware. Some of the other things you can do, launching tickets. So whether you have Jira or something like ServiceNow, maybe ticketing is core to your incident response. But again, being able to track and record these things, obviously very important. And not only can I do it on a manual perspective, I can actually go ahead and set up, so once I click run, I can also say, okay, if I want to do this automatically for similar alarms in the future, I can create a rule that will automatically go ahead and generate that action on my behalf. Say it happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, then I definitely want to be notified, but at the same time, I want to generate that ticket or response in order to mitigate that risk as quickly as possible before I can actually get into the system and start doing some investigation and triage. So that's just a very quick snapshot of what you can do within USM Anywhere. Obviously, we're somewhat out of time. Now, do you have any question there for our audience today? Or?
Yeah, thank you, Sacha. We do want to launch a quick poll here just to see if anyone is interested in a personalized demo of USM Anywhere. So we'll go ahead and launch that now. Great. Thank you, everybody. And I think that about wraps it up for today, unless there's anything else, Sacha or John? Or...
No, I'll just kind of end on this slide. Just it shows different areas within which USM Anywhere can really help you with GDPR compliance. Again, it's the technical controls. We have security essentials, the asset discovery, vulnerability assessment, intrusion detection, the SIM, and reporting capabilities. We do have a number of certifications. We're actually going through GDPR certification or attestation of compliance for USM Anywhere. We'll have that very soon. The ability to really investigate those breaches as quickly as possible. So we actually aggregate and store that information for you centrally. And it's just a very easy to deploy, easy to use product. If you're interested in finding out a bit more information, you can certainly get online, check out our online demo. You're looking to sign up for it and get straight into the sandbox, start playing with it. Or you can actually download a trial and work with that inside your environment. So
I do want to add one quick thing. RSA's next week. I will be there. If you would like to sit down and talk about GDPR or whatnot, please go to the booth. They know how to get a hold of me because I'll be attending some of the sessions, but I'm more than happy to sit down with a drink and talk GDPR.
Yeah, and likewise, I'll be there as well. So I'll be at the booth. Anyway, thanks everybody for your attention today and for hearing about GDPR. And again, we'll be posting this up soon. And anyway, all the best. Thank you very much.